All right, we are going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Rachel DeCruz. I am the Chief of Staff at Race Forward, and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I want to give a big welcome to the almost 800 folks that have registered for today's webinar and everybody who's joining us via Facebook Live. Today's webinar is called Race and the Movement Forward, Looking Past the Vote and Mobilizing for Racial Justice. This is the second of a three-part webinar series. The first, Race and the Vote, looked at the grassroots organizing for voter turnout leading up to the November election and the necessity of continued organizing beyond the elections. Today's conversation expands on the momentum of that organizing and will explore how we sustain a strong movement for racial justice. I also want to encourage everybody to stay tuned for the third part of this conversation, when we'll hear from organizers leading for policy change to advance racial justice at the federal level. I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathering on stolen, occupied land. And Nico, you can move to the next slide. The United States is founded upon racial hierarchy, stolen Indigenous lands, broken treaties with Indigenous nations, and domination over Native peoples on Turtle Island. Today, I live and work on the lands of Muscogee Creek Nation in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Native communities and people continue to survive, thrive, and organize, and it's up to us to figure out how we can support the organizing that's happening in our local communities. I want to quickly share a few logistics before we launch into the meat of our program today. Everyone on Zoom is currently on mute and off camera, but you can message the panelists in case you're having tech difficulties, and Leslie will help you out. You can send your questions in via the Q&A button, and our lovely staff are going to help sort through them and consolidate them so that we can answer as many as possible during the Q&A section of our webinar. We also have ASL interpreters with us today to help make our webinar as inclusive as possible. So I want to give a big shout out and thank you to Shannon and Bernice. And I want to give a huge thank you to our webinar team and our communications team who have made this town hall a reality. I have the distinct pleasure of working with a brilliant and passionate group of folks at Race Forward, and I'm really excited for today's conversation. You can move us to the next slide, Nico. Beautiful. So before we launch into our panel discussion, I want to provide some brief background and framing for everyone. Race Forward catalyzes movement building for racial justice. In partnership with communities, organizations, and sectors, we build strategies to advance racial justice in our policies, institutions, and culture. We're basically trying to create a world where race no longer predicts life outcomes for people. You can move to the next slide, Nico. As all of you know, we're facing a pivotal moment in our country's history. What we do in these next few months and years will define the kind of society that we pass down to future generations. Last year, in the aftermath of the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we saw a massive uprising for racial justice that mobilized people across the globe. Millions joined together to march in support of Black Lives Matter and to denounce police brutality. The November election saw a historic turnout, with record-breaking numbers of young folks and people of color voting. We saw that states that were historically red, like Georgia and Arizona, flipped to blue. We're now ushering in a new administration that outlined racial equity as a distinct pillar in their plan to rebuild the country, and we need to hold them accountable to the progressive promises that were made. Just last week, Georgia elected their first Black senator and the first Jewish senator from the state, who is also the youngest senator in the new Congress. These victories did not happen in a vacuum. They are the direct result of deep and sustained organizing being led by communities of color across the country, with Black women at the forefront. This organizing started long before the elections, and it will continue long after. We also know that there will be challenges and pushback against the progress we've made. Nico, you can advance to the next slide. Just last week, we saw a group of armed insurrectionists lay siege to our capital in an attempt to block the peaceful transition of power. This was a stark reminder of what white supremacy looks like when it goes unchecked, and it was a wake-up call about how fragile our multiracial democracy truly is. Last week, we saw law enforcement officers allow armed white vigilantes to take a federal building by force. We sadly know all too well the excessive force that law enforcement uses against unarmed, peaceful protesters who are standing up for justice. As we said in a press statement released with our partners, this is the epitome of racist hypocrisy. I want you to make no mistake. The events in Washington, D.C. were against the idea of a specific kind of democracy, one where people of color wield political power. We know that we'll continue to see similar attacks and pushback in the weeks leading up to the inauguration and into the future. And what we want to discuss today with all of you is how the racial justice movement can build on the power of the racial justice uprisings of 2020 and the historic voter turnout we saw last election cycle to create a stronger, more cohesive movement, a movement that's able to withstand the inevitable challenges and threats. Before we turn the floor over to our panelists, I want to quickly ground us in Race Forward's work. And you can advance to the next slide. We believe that there are 4 necessary components to building a just, multiracial, democratic society. The first is to build power. We need to expand the base of racial justice advocates across this country, and we need to be really focused on connecting and aligning networks of people, organizations, and movements to help build our collective power. We need to transform policy. Not only do we need to be passing racially equitable policies that get us to a different set of outcomes, but we also need to position communities of color as leaders and decision makers in the policy-making process. We know that we need to transform institutions and sectors, that both institutions and sectors need to operationalize racial equity in their policies, practices, and outcomes, and that it's up to us to hold them accountable to doing that. And then last, but certainly not least, we need to transform culture. We have the ability to harness the power of narrative, arts, and culture to assert the full humanity of communities of color and to start telling different stories about our communities that center us in our power and purpose. I am so excited to be in dialogue with our incredible panelists today who are going to help us strategize about how we take advantage of this moment to push towards transformational change. And so could our panelists put their videos on so we can see your beautiful faces? Thank you. So today we are joined by Paris Hatcher, the director and founder of Black Feminist Future, by Candice Moore, who's the Chief Equity Officer in the city of Chicago, and by Rinku Sen, who's the Executive Director of Narrative Initiatives. So I want to start with a question directed to all of you and just give you some space to share more about yourself and your work for racial justice. What are you focused on building as part of the racial justice movement? And I'd love to start with Paris.
Hey y'all, my name is Paris Hatcher. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm coming from Atlanta, Georgia, where it is it's sunny but cold here. Some may not believe that, but it is. And I'm really glad to be in conversation with y'all today. And when I think about what I'm building, what I'm helping to build in our larger racial justice movement, is that I am building, helping to build a robust, dynamic, powerful, dynamic, robust, powerful Black feminist leaders, organizations, and movements that will be at the forefront of a 21st century feminist movement. So that's what I'm building towards. And thanks for having me.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Paris. Candice, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Candice Moore. I serve as the Chief Equity Officer here in the office of the mayor here in the city of Chicago. It is not sunny and it's cold, so a little less enjoyable than Georgia. But this is that time of year for us here in Chicago. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. And when I think about what I'm trying to build, especially being in government, I really sort of think a lot about capacity. How do we grow our capacity to understand, to learn, to do the work, and to fundamentally reimagine how we do business as a city? And so I pour my thoughts and my ideas and a lot of my labor into the work of capacity building.
Great, thank you, Candice. And last but certainly not least, Rinku.
Thank you. It's wonderful to see everybody. My name is Rinku, she, her, hers pronouns. I am coming to you from Round Rock, Texas. There are many Native nations related to Texas. I'll just name a few: Comanche, Kickapoo, Apache, and Caddo. And what I am working to build as the ED of Narrative Initiative, which I have been for about 6 weeks, is a narrative crew, a crew of creatives, both artistic creatives and political creatives, who are going to work together to move the big stories, the overarching mass stories that we need to then move people to the kinds of actions that we want them to take for the kinds of results that we want from our institutions and systems.
Thank you, Rinku. And thanks to all of you. I think that was a really powerful way to kick us off. So we're going to move into one of the things that we think is really important at Race Forward is to reflect on the lessons that we learn along the way so that we can use the stuff that's working well and double down on it, and we can turn away from the stuff that didn't work so well. So would love to actually have each of you reflect on the following questions. What have you learned from the last 4 years or from this election cycle in relation to the racial justice movement? What are some of the strategies that have led to positive change for racial justice, and what hasn't worked? And Paris, if you're willing to kick us off again, that would be great.
Awesome. So there are a multitude of lessons. And as a Southern girl, I can really give a lot of lessons from this region, and particular from where I've been living for almost the last 20 years, Georgia. But I think to pull back some, I think the last 4 years have really helped to sharpen, or hopefully help to remove the veil from eyes from folks who maybe doubt that the system, the larger system that we live in is racist, and that it's also patriarchal, and that capitalism is a big driver as well, a huge driver. Capitalism as an economic system. And so I feel like we are better, especially with the demands of this last summer, where we had the largest social movement in ever take action in defense of Black lives. People were starting to make the connection that it wasn't just around bad apples or individual actors, right? That we have to move from thinking only about individuals, but really looking at institutions and systems around what we must root out to create the societies and communities that we really deserve. So I would say the last 4 years, that's why we say it's not just about Trump himself, it's about Trumpism, right? So it's not, yes, he is a figure of this movement, but it's actually his beliefs, his practices that are also embodied and enacted by other players beyond him. I believe that if folks didn't know before, we can also look at the impact of COVID and how devastating that it has been along lines, not just of race, but also of gender, when that the most recent report that showed around the job growth, the job losses, where that overwhelmingly 150,000 jobs were lost. But it showed that the losses were around Black and Latina women. And, there was job growth and development around white women and white men. And I'm also thinking about how billionaires got richer. So Amazon, I mean, my goodness, Amazon's not alone. So capitalism continues in a time of crisis. That system continues to grow as this very hungry, insatiable beast that puts profit over people. And people literally did not have toilet paper. I also think that something that we've learned, we can look at the case of Georgia, that organizing is how we win. that long-term relational organizing, that what may look like magic in Georgia actually was work, right? That people have been breaking this ground open for generations, truly, for voting rights, right? Just for the right to vote, to not, just to have access to that. But we still deal with disenfranchisement where people's votes just 4 years ago, or 2 years ago with Stacey Abrams' campaign for governor, people were disenfranchised. So it's not organized. It's not just magic, voila. It has been relational, deep organizing. I would also add what else I think a lesson that has been really invigorating is that we must lead with incredible, beautiful narrative. And I learned that when I worked with Rinku at Race Forward. And I continue to learn this as with leadership within the movement for Black Lives, especially with the demand around defund the police, having a bold demand that really is, anchored in what we want to see, which is, it's not just defund the police, it's invest in Black communities, invest in Black life is the rest of it, allows us to actually win. And we are in a different position now than we've been in a long time, because we've had really incredible organizing for decades that has not been resourced the way that we've needed it to be. We've seen an investment in really talking about not just communities of color, but like we need to invest in Black communities, Latinx communities, Asian American, Pacific Islander communities, Indigenous, Native communities, like really specific, tailored program and leadership led by these folks, and strong narrative, right? So it takes a long time to shift the narrative, but we have more people who are talking about defund the police than I never thought we would be here. And look what's possible. So there's a lot of lessons, lots of things I'm excited about, and I'll just stop there.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Paris. Candice, do you want to share next?
Sure. I was listening a lot to what Paris was saying, and also kind of thinking about what I would add. So I want to kind of ditto so much of what Paris said. And when I think about the last 4 years, one of the things that sits with me is the power of kind of this, what seems like a polite, unassuming, middle complacency that ought to be, that even as we think about the challenges of the Trump presidency and what we've seen in the last 4 years, I have to admit, I am still shocked by how many folks could watch that and, hide under complacency, under status quo. And I shouldn't be shocked, and I am, right? Like there's a present sort of like, I can't believe that I have to have this conversation. I can't believe that we're arguing about this. I can't believe that even after X, Y, Z, we're still having a conversation about whether something needs to be different. And so I think in a lot of ways, the last 4 years have just revealed and exposed exactly how much work has to be done, despite sometimes the bubble that I find myself in, where sometimes I joke and say my Facebook was good. I didn't have a lot of problems on my Facebook because I know who's on there for the most part, but my Facebook isn't the world. My social, my networks, and my channel isn't the world. And I feel like so much of that just really has been exposed over the last 4 years. And you just realize the conversations you're not having with folks, though, the things that people aren't owning and processing and understanding. I think some of the positive strategies, and whereas I certainly think there's a ton of work to continue around narrative change, I'm still kind of in awe of some of the narrative change work that I think has happened. Now, that doesn't mean it's pure and people don't muddle it up, but there have been times where I'm watching TV and I'm like, I cannot believe I'm listening to this conversation on this mainstream news channel, and they're really actually talking about structural issues in a regular segment. This isn't the sort of Black History Month special. This isn't any of that. We're actually having this conversation. And so, whereas there's certainly a ton more work to be done, I think some of the positive strategies, you see them. I think they are meeting the moment and manifesting. I think what we have to figure out is, how do we maintain and grow? How do we not sit back in the victory of Georgia and say, okay, now y'all go ahead and do X, Y, and Z, and I'll see you in 4 years. What hasn't worked is, keeping the momentum in a lot of ways, and fueling the moment in the way that we need it and the strategy that we need, so that we can maintain the work that needs to happen in front of us. So I certainly think we need more strategy. We need more ways to bring folks under the tent and put them to work to advance the work that needs to happen.
Thank you so much, Candice. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with everything Candice and Paris said. So piling on top of that, I think that we learned, particularly this year, a lot about the power of mutual aid and the need for it, and how it makes people feel to know that someone is with you. And I want to just point out that in our organizing traditions, the ones that all of us come from, mutual aid was a really huge part of that, huge part of the movement to abolish slavery, huge part of the movement to protect farm workers and immigrants. So it's just in every single one of our communities, from white to Native to Indigenous, mutual aid has been connected to direct action organizing. It was the same people who built their bonds by helping each other out, who then challenged government, challenged corporate behavior, took power. So I really, really hope that mutual aid continues to be becomes reintegrated into our organizing systems and our organizing theory. And I'll leave that there for right now. I'm going to say that the narrative progress we made in this period, things like getting structural racism into the popular discourse, not just the national discourse, but the popular discourse, where your everyday person who doesn't watch MSNBC every night picks it up somewhere, often at the water cooler or at the breakfast table, talking with their family and friends, that some of the keys to making those shifts in the way people think about things is speed. It matters. So something happens, and we now have enough people who are fast communicators who can jump into the discussion and contribute key concepts and ideas and language and stories. So we have gotten a lot faster as a movement at jumping in as the story was being built through action, in our actions, but also the actions of people who are trying to keep us down. And then I think we did make some real progress in these 4 years around building cross-racial and multiracial relationships, and at building the organizing power in multiple communities so that they could then contribute to multiracial movement in effective ways. I think we saw that in Georgia, and just like it happened in my very own life while I was at college, the way I read the Georgia story is that Black organizers, particularly Black women, got got themselves together, made a plan, crafted a strategy, and then recruited their friends from Asian and Latinx communities and indigenous communities to join in. And you can see some really remarkable results of that from Georgia. So in addition to the enormous historic numbers of Black people voting in this last election, before the Georgia primaries, Latinx groups, including Mi Gente, spoke to every single Latino registered voter in the state, every single one. That is some serious saturation. Among Asian voters, 50% of those who voted in the runoff were first-time voters. They hadn't even voted in the general election in Georgia. So those are the kinds of numbers at scale that we have to be able to get to. This is a very big country. There are 330 million people in it. And in order for us to hold on to whatever we manage to win and to expand it, we're going to have to expand those numbers. There are two lessons where I think we could have paid more attention, and we will need to pay very serious attention moving forward. One is disinformation is rampant. It is rife, and it is hitting people in ways that are cultish. So you believe this and you belong. You don't believe this, you no longer belong. And everybody wants to belong. And you can't fight disinformation with fact sheets. It's not going to happen. You fight disinformation, all of the data shows, actually through relationships. So all of the unfriending that we did during these last 4 years, my relative who voted for Trump, I had to cut them off. I can't take it anymore. I can't talk to them. We're going to have to do the opposite, in fact, if we're going to fight off disinformation, because the trusted source is the only way. And it's terrible. It's very disheartening that someone can believe a bunch of crap from people they've never met that's floating around Facebook, and they won't believe me when I tell them the facts. But here we are. We have to live in reality and not in our fantasy of how we wish things were and how they used to be in the 80s when I started organizing. So disinformation is going to be a huge challenge for us. I do not think that we actually have built the systems and infrastructure and relationships we need to have to fight it. And while I'm talking about relationships, I'm going to beat this drum that I have been beating privately for a while, which is that we need to make friends, not allies. Alliances are too transactional for the depth of relationship we need and for the depth of challenge we have, which is made worse by disinformation, but was already pretty big before disinformation became the way it is. And our frameworks around allies and allyship, how allies should behave, what they should be doing for us, what they should never be doing, the expectation that allies do what they do, they should never expect praise or credit or a pat on the back because they're just doing what they're supposed to be doing. All of that runs counter to what I actually know about fruitful relationships in politics or anywhere else, which is that people will stick together better if they know each other. If we know each other only to the extent we need to know each other to make a transaction, I give you this, you give me this, it is just not going to be enough. This fragile coalition we've built during the period that we had a common enemy in Donald Trump and Trumpism, that's gone. That's over. I understand that right-wing ideas are not over, white supremacy is not over, but the national common enemy we have had as progressives, as communities of color, that is going to be gone. And if we're going to make that coalition strong enough to take us into the future, it has to be based on something more than theories about how we control our allies and make them do what we want. There has to be a genuine relationship there. Maybe love is too far afield, but friendship feels to me like a reasonable framework for what we're trying to be to each other within our communities and across our communities that might give us the strength we need to win the next round of victories.
Thank you so much, Rinku. Ooh, thanks to all of you. Those were some really powerful and beautiful responses. And that was a lot of information that you all just shared. So I was jotting down some top level notes. I just wanted to reflect it back to our participants so we can kind of shore up those lessons and remember them as we move forward. So I heard the negative and harmful ways that racism, patriarchy, and capitalism are intersecting to impact our communities. I heard the need to focus on institutions and systems, that organizing is how we win, and that organizing needs to be relational and deep, that we have to invest in Black life. I heard about the power of complacency and how we need to find ways to combat and push back against that as we move forward. Heard the fact that we've made some progress in narrative and thinking about the idea of people talking about systemic and structural racism in ways that we probably couldn't have even imagined a few years ago. And that we need to be thinking about how we maintain and grow that progress and how we keep up momentum. And I also heard about the importance of mutual aid, that the relationship building that's inherent in mutual aid is a strategy that will help us as we move forward, that we have as a movement gotten faster at kind of jumping into stories as they're starting. So we have the ability to more thoroughly frame the narrative. That multiracial organizing work has been incredibly important and powerful, and it's been a big reason why we're here today. And that disinformation is fought through relationships, and we need friends, not allies. So thank you all. I'm excited that I jotted all that down so I can refer back to it. So we're going to move into a question now, which Candice, I'm going to start with you, but then want to open it up to the rest of the panelists. So it's clear that if we're going to get to a different set of outcomes for our communities, we need to develop accountable institutions that operationalize racial equity. And Candice, you work in the city of Chicago. You're part of a local administration that ran your campaign on change and made commitments to racial justice. And so given that background and given that you are now in local government, would love to hear what your advice is as we think about and prepare for new leadership at the federal level.
Yeah, so I serve as our city's first chief equity officer, and it was it was a big deal to have that in our city government, and to create an office of equity and racial justice that sort of set forth this charge about how this administration was going to be thinking. I sit here about a year and some change in saying, it's really, really hard. As someone who comes to this work, I come to this work in my prior job, I was a civil rights attorney, pushing on systems and really working alongside community members. And I had this vision that, so much of what I was dealing with as a civil rights attorney was the aftermath of harm, right? Trying to push against things that have happened. And man, if we could just get in earlier when decisions are being made, like we could have much more of an impact. The reality is that I'm finding is when we talk about systems being designed, systems working regardless of intent, we have to realize that we're operating within systems that have historically been moving for a very long time, and despite best intentions, you are moving against the current in a lot of ways, which makes the work hard, tough, slow, in the same environment where there is urgency and there is harm continuing to happen. And so one of the conversations I had to have with myself, even as I took this job, is what is that going to mean if I'm trying to push and advance something and harm is still happening right underneath my hands, my feet? What is that going to mean for how I'm going to operate? How am I going to think about this work? What is my job? What does this mean? And so as I think, on the federal level, we have a lot of momentum in this moment, but we can't forget that it doesn't change with a switch. It's going to be the product of many people getting into alignment, the product of capacity building, the product of strategy, the product of mitigating harm, the product of transforming systems, rewiring things. In a lot of ways, this is not the sexy work, right? Sometimes I joke, I'm like, I don't think anyone really cares if I rewrite a protocol or I pull some data together that never was together. But to me, that work is mission critical because that's the work that will outlive me in my position. That is the capacity that we can build in institutions for our departments, for our entities, for our institutions to have different kinds of goalposts, to think about the strategy by which they engage with communities, the way that they understand equity. That's the work that will outlive my own individual leadership, let alone the leadership of our administration. But that's the work that we have to pour ourselves into, especially when you come inside institutions, and at the same time sit in the tension. And it is challenging. It is uncomfortable of recognizing that you're not starting in a pure state. Systems are still moving underneath you. And how are you going to show up and move forward and in that moment and sort of define that this work is not about Candice and her leadership or the mayor and her leadership. This work is about our institutional impact and what we can do. So I think a lot about that as we think about the federal level, the harm that has happened for the last 4 years. I almost say, was anybody taking notes of every little change that happened? Because if we don't sort of, strategically think about all of the different decisions that were made, those things live there. It doesn't matter if you get a new head of the agency, right? If they don't then think about how they're going to rewrite that, if they don't think about how they're going to change that, if they're not thinking about that, there's a lot of undoing work. And we weren't even at a wonderful state to begin with, right? So this is the challenge I think of that I sit in as I think about what it means to be a change agent in institutions, and also recognize where I am, my positionality, my limitations. It is different from being an advocate for me, but a lot of the principles and the values that I have in the work are still the same, even if some of the position and the tools that I have in moving this work is different. So.
Thank you so much for that, Candice. Rinku or Paris, do either of you want to build off of anything Candice shared or react to this question?
I can say something. So I think one of the things that we have done really well is move our language and our concepts into the mainstream. We did that through a combination of storytelling and other kinds of communications. Not all communication is storytelling, right? Some of it is listing out demands, and some of it is explaining things, how the system works, why we're in this position. And my read is that from a narrative change perspective, we have done a lot. We have gotten many people who are right on the edge of agreeing with us and understanding our frameworks. We've gotten them over that edge and firmly into the mix. I've been organizing since 1984, I think. And this is the most organizing energy I've ever seen in the country. And I'm not sure I ever thought we were going to get here. So I'm a little bit surprised, actually. And um, and so even the fact that when you say community organizing, people know what you're talking about now. You don't have to start with, no, it's not about my closet or, my backyard or whatever. That's how that was always the start when I was, first starting out, and I tell people I was an organizer, they'd be like, can you do my closet? Um, so, so that's been great. And yet, like I said, the audiences are vast. There are many people who are still underexposed to organizing, many people who never hear from any political candidate, much less an organizer or a local leader. So I think where we're at is we can congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. And we can also recognize that if we want to go beyond who we have now, we might need some new narrative tactics and communications tactics. And for me, it's the difference between doing turnout communications. I'm just trying to reach the people who are looking for me and activate them. That's turnout communications. To persuasion communications, I'm going to go now looking for the people who don't agree with me, don't think we have much in common. We may have an identity in common. They may be Indian immigrants, middle-class Indian immigrants, overeducated, over formally educated. But if they don't think like I do, but I want them, which I do, I want to split up the complacent class. I want to try to split up liberals and get more of them into the progressive camp. Then I have to think about persuasion communications. And persuasion communications always are more about the other person than they are about you. They have less to do with what feels right to you to say and more to do with what that person needs to hear in order to move in your direction. And that can feel, when we're thinking that way about how we're communicating, that can feel like we're giving up a lot. I'm giving up my ability to say what feels good to me to say at any given moment. I'm thinking about the audience more than I'm thinking about the speaker or the communicator. There are some pivots in practice that are required if you're moving from turnout communications to persuasion communications. There's different kinds of data to gather so that you can see if you're being effective. There are different words to use, literally different words to use, different stories to tell. And I think that's something that we have to get okay with, so that we can keep growing our base.
And I'll add around, I think a lot about the work of my organization, Black Feminist Future. And I think Black feminisms in general, one of the key pieces of our work is making the invisible visible. And I'm thinking about this in relationship to the federal government and what this new administration will mean. What will it mean around policy? What can it mean? And there's a lot of hope around that. And in particular, when we start to connect the dots between who secured the victory, and then what does it mean in reference to federal policy, or actually having the material conditions of those communities be different. And oftentimes there's the dots are not connected, right? And so I'm really interested in federal policies that are not just looking at race, right? Or I need Black feminist policies, federal policies. And these are policies, it's actually why I was like really into Elizabeth Warren as a candidate, because what she was offering were policies that I know for sure were going to have make a tremendous difference in the lives of so many people, like universal childcare. it is the invisible work. And I think COVID really has highlighted the invisible work that really requires everything else to happen, that is underpaid or not paid at all. And yet it's the backbone of everything, the care work. So canceling student debt, right? Or thinking about what healthcare would mean, a universal healthcare plan would mean, or just around access to reproductive health care. Those are just some of the, and how do we actually think about on the federal level, the COVID viruses happen, right? The response was failed. So that's actually what the issue is. The government response was the failure. And it's going to be on the minimum, at least a decade to recover from the failure of the federal government's response to COVID and the number of jobs lost, lives lost, the instability, the care work. Literally, we just did a report called Black Women Are Essential. Women are talking about they're in a 24-hour work cycle. There is literally no break. And I firmly believe that the way that things shut down, it was absolutely dependent on the feminization of labor, of care work, right? So you can't shut down schools unless you know there's going to be somebody there to take care of children, right? In the home. You can't shut down certain sectors of life in that way unless you're depending on the invisible workforce, the feminization of work. And so I'm really hopeful that federal policy can, yes, be thinking about racial justice, but also be thinking about what's a feminist approach to make sure that so many folks who have been invisibilized by racial justice policy can really be central in how we recover from the last 4 years, as well as our current pandemic.
Thank you all so much. There's a lot of food for thought there as we think about what institutional accountability looks like at the federal level. Rinku, I want to pick up on something that you named. I feel like in your comments so far, you've been reflecting a little bit on sort of the landscape related to narrative more broadly, and started to talk about the need for some pivots in practice. And would love if you could help lean into what it looks like to build narrative power for racial justice in a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, I've been perusing some of the questions that are starting to come in and comments in the chat. And there are a couple of things I would say. One, the first thing is understanding what makes a story. So in my work over the last 10 years or so, including when I was still at Race Forward, there was a thing that would always happen where I'd tell people, tell me a story. And what they would tell me a story about the issue that you're working on. And what they would tell me would be more of a description. So an example is they'd say, well, my kid's in middle school and in his school, there's no toilet paper. They have very old books. The hallways are coming apart. That is a description. In a story, I need to see your kid. You need to tell me something about them. In a story, things happen. I don't know how many of us like to watch films where nothing happens, like there's somebody sitting in a room by themselves and you just watch them for an hour and a half. We don't tend to engage in those or consider them stories. So there has to be action in a story. So the first thing is for all of us to really think about the stories that are available to us, that are in our own lives, and that we can feel good about sharing, but make sure there's a character, make sure there's action, make sure I know what the setting is, and make sure it has a moral, an idea grounding it. So storytelling is one big thing. The second thing I want to say is I'm going to point people towards some resources here. At narrativeinitiative.org, which is where I work, and I'll drop these into the chat in a minute, there's a report called Towards a New Gravity, which is about narrative strategies in social justice. And near the end of that report, there is a quote by Erin Potts, who organizes musicians. And she says, I wish people could understand, I'm paraphrasing, I wish people could understand that in order for us to win on issues, we need to stop talking about issues. And what she means by that is that rather than talking about issues, we need to talk about values. Now, I get that the whole country doesn't share all of our values. And that we could feel cynical about, like, do people really value justice? Do they really value equity? Do they really value compassion or democracy? But this is a little bit of a fake it till you make it thing, that if we stop talking about our values, then they drop away, they fall out of the discourse. And but values have to be backed up by stories in order for the human brain to recognize it and integrate it. The very last thing I'll say here is I was looking at some research recently into different audiences and what they're consuming. And it shows that the very same people who resist something like immigration policy reform, we don't want more immigrants, we don't want to make it easier, we don't want to legalize the people who have been living here for years without papers. These very same people are consuming tons of stories about immigrants. So one way that you can bridge, and yet most of what we communicate about in our movement is policies and issues. So you can make a bridge here by first inserting actual humans into your communications. People are more open to learning about immigrants than they are to learning about immigration policy. And if we want to reach the folks on immigration or climate change or raising the minimum wage, we need to supplement our fact sheet kind of things with stories of actual human beings. And later we can talk about, like, platforms and how you get those out into the world. So those are three things: stories and how you actually craft them, focusing on values, and putting real human beings into our discourse.
Thank you, Rinku. Paris and Candice, do either of you have anything you want to share related to narrative? No. Okay. Great, Rinku covered it. We're good. Okay, so I want to move into a question for you, Paris, thinking about building power, right? And specifically building power of communities of color. We know that that's foundational to advancing racial justice, and all of the progress we've all kind of touched on throughout this conversation today reinforces that point. And so would love to have you reflect a little bit, given the momentum following the election in November and the recent one in Georgia. How do we build on that organizing power and deepen organizing for racial justice? And what are your thoughts on how we shift our approach and organize for rather than against?
Well, I'm learning more and more around narrative, and I just want to give a shout out to you, Rinku, who I feel like you've been the tip of the spear around narrative and the power of stories, and how crucial it is in the work that we're doing in building our social justice and liberation movements. And I really have been super inspired by the work that we're doing at Movement for Black Lives around building narrative. And in particular, Chanel Matthews, who helped to found the Radical Communicators Network. It talks a lot around narrative power, and now I'm like a sucker for narrative power. Just because I'm really interested and really curious around how, I'm thinking more and more, it relates to organizing around, I think about my work in 25-year chunks. So what am I trying to do in 25 years? So in a generation, what can we advance? What is possible? What can we sustain? What are norms that we thought were just going to be How can we just upend them? And what I'm finding is that we're upending them faster and faster, as like Rinku had mentioned. So mind you, I'm from North Carolina. That's like, from the transatlantic slave ship, that's where my people were. And then I've been there, like my people. And so moving from folks who were slaves to sharecroppers to owning the land that they were enslaved on to not being able to vote. My mom could not drink from segregated water fountains, could not wear pants to school. Like, no, my grandma was married, and when she was pregnant, as a school teacher, was told she could not teach because what if she could show, and that would just be too much if she were visibly pregnant teaching. So she literally lost her job and came back after she gave birth, right? Now, that would be a big situation now, right? They talk about different conditions, saying that I couldn't wear, I grew up wearing pants. And so I get really excited around what's possible around organizing in reference to how organizing shifts conditions. It helps to shift culture. It helps to push norms and what in the next 25 years is possible. So I think so much of what we're marveling around Georgia is that it's like, wow, we didn't think it was possible. But those of us who've lived here knew it was possible. And again, I don't want us to give into like the magic thinking it was work that made it possible. That Georgia is it's a mecca for a variety of communities. It's a mecca for Black communities. It's a mecca for queer and trans communities, meaning like millions of folks are coming here, finding their community, building families. It's a mecca for, what people are calling the new American majority. Folks who have, been here for generations or are just arriving here. So many different immigrant and refugee communities are based here in Georgia. And so what I'm imagining is building more power. And so the shift for me, and when I think about Georgia, when I think about what's possible, is that how do we start to understand folks as just, and this is the work that I see building, not just as the voter, right? But the voter then to the people who are setting the agenda, right? So, I think that's actually what we're talking about, is that folks who are creating and setting agendas, who are also participating in governance in their own local governments, who are establishing new ways of being, new norms, new ways of being in community where mutual aid is the way that we are going to be together, right? So I'm imagining something, I feel like organizing is really our way forward, and it will it will look different ways, right? I don't think it's just organizing where it is like the door knocking, knowing your neighbor, talking about what matters the most to you. But I'm really interested in culture as this really big motivator, and a way that people are organizing to be able to understand issues that they never really understood before. And in particular, I think pop culture has provided a really unique opportunity for people to really start to understand, or people who wanted to be just on the sidelines, like you actually can't be neutral, as Candice had mentioned before. But I also want to say, like, right now we are in a time, and I hope we continue to do this, so we can amplify more of our wins. So while the federal does get a lot of our conversations, and oftentimes state electoral work in general, not just state, but electoral work gets a lot of energy, grassroots organizing has been doing incredible work. So I'll take the example of Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Wisconsin has been organizing for 4 or 5 years to remove cops from their schools, their public schools. And, successfully in 2020, we're able to move cops from schools and have that budget. It's been like it's been a budget fight, but they were able to successfully to remove cops from schools. And they're not the only place around the country that have said, we actually know what our communities want. We want resources. We don't want criminalization. Let's actually resource what we need. Even here in in Atlanta, the city of Atlanta in Georgia, though we are now seen as like this blue phenom, we really are dealing with local and state politics that have been really quite regressive, especially when it comes to reproductive justice. But the city of Atlanta passed a reproductive justice commission and really working towards to advance reproductive health rights and justice, in particular the needs of communities of color here in the city of Atlanta. And there, in New York City, there was work around expanding reproductive access and including abortion access. There's work that's happening across the country around local victories where people have been working for a really long time around a variety of issues that I think we owe it to ourselves to amplify. I think about places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, who've been organizing for more just policies around a variety of like reproductive health care and justice issues. And so I think there's so much potential. We need to resource it, right? So as Ashley Henderson says, like, fund us like you want us to win, that we must be building and funding grassroots organizing. We must be funding and resourcing movement work. We need to be in position, ready to advance bold, amazing, creative demands. And yeah, I'm looking forward to now and what our next 25 years and beyond are going to look like, and how we are continue to shift culture, shift policy, shift the way we are with each other to the socially just ways that we imagine, that we've been envisioning for so long.
Thank you so much, Paris. That was beautiful. I also feel like you did a really great job of modeling, bringing storytelling into that response. So thank you for that. So I'm just cognizant, I'm looking at the time. I think we have a few more minutes for this question before we move into the Q&A from the audience. And so Rinku and Candice, is there anything that you want to reflect on related to building power before we transition?
I had one thought when Paris was talking, but I can't even honestly say that I think it's that connected to what you were saying. It just popped into my head. So I'll share it. So being in a institution like the city, I'm often thinking about how am I going to get people to do stuff? We set goals, we have policies, like how am I going to get people to do stuff? And to me, this thought about like, there's a difference between power and position, right? So I sit in the mayor's office in Chicago. That means a lot. The mayor's office is quite powerful, especially relative to different departments and agencies. And I can say, you need to do X, Y, and Z. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to get done. And that doesn't mean it's going to get done with the fidelity it needs to get done, or the vision or the heart. And so I have really been convicted about the importance of also giving people the why, building the bigger culture and capacity around the work, because we can make all the policy plans that we want, but there's a million little decisions in between. And if that is not resourced, if capacity is also not poured into that, then culture eats strategy all day. And, that is the tougher part of the work. Trying to actually turn a policy or a position into the depths of the kind of work that is going to actually get the thing done, and get it done with the spirit and heart that we know we need in order to have a much more transformational impact. And so I think this conversation about power, sometimes people feel like they are not powerful because they are not in position. And I think we really need to understand the power that can come from whatever space that we're occupying. Like, do that job well, do that job, build. You can really build from that and produce the kinds of results that we really so desperately need in our work.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really great question. I grew up hearing all the time, information is power. But I think, as Candice is pointing out, nothing is power but power. Only power is actual power. Position is not power. Information is not power. So information and position can contribute to power building, but they are not power in themselves. So I think the first thing is to define power for people and show folks what it really looks like. And I think the way we do that is just to repeat Paris, telling stories of our victories. This is why it's so important, why it's so critical in organizing, that one of the first rules is you celebrate every victory, no matter how small, because who wants to like play on a losing team month after month? Like nobody. There's enough loss in our lives. Why would we sign up for more of it? So you gotta, yes, like the Knicks, exactly. So we have to get good at showing why the tiniest thing, like even if the tiniest thing, like, you know, your city council creates a commission to study something, that's not a substantive win, it's a procedural win. And yet we have to celebrate the hell out of it, call it what it is. It's procedural, it's only a step along the way, but really celebrate it. And most of how we talk is 80% problem and 20% solution. And I'm being generous calling it 20%. Like if I did content analysis of most of our panel presentations and speeches, I bet I'd find it being closer to 90% problem. And then we might mention a bit of solution at the end. We have to reverse those proportions. And I'll just offer a resource and drop it into the chat too. At Narrative Initiative, we're going to be integrating something that I and some colleagues started in the fall, which is a ghostwriting service for organizers and leaders. So you want some blog posts, you want a great Twitter thread, you want to send a letter to the editor of your local paper. We have a system for you to sign up and get that kind of help. And when you do, we're going to push you around that. Like we're not doing 6 tweets, 5 of which are about the problem. Like, no. So those are my bits of advice. Only power is actual power, 80% solutions, 20% problems. And I forget whatever else I said. So hopefully someone captured it, but, oh, and victories, celebrate every single.
Rinku, I would love an example. I think you're right. We love to give like the facts, like this is why it sucks. And it sucks because of this, but could you give an example of the 80-20?
Yes. If you look at a lot of our discourse around healthcare, including during the COVID period, we see a lot of information about disproportionate impact on people of color of the problems in the healthcare industry. And then we see like slogans for the solution. So you have like data and terrible stories, sad stories about people losing their loved ones, and then Medicare for all. That's it. Like, and so we expect that people are going to connect all this suffering to the slogan of a program, a solution that they don't understand. We don't describe Medicare for all. We just say, now we demand Medicare for all, after spending 10 minutes of telling sad stories, which are depressing us. I hear like 10 sad stories in a row. I want to get under my covers and never come out again. But if I hear one sad story and then here's how this person got involved in advocating for the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and hey, we won that. Now we want to drive further to a public option or Medicare for all. Just a good practice rule is start with the solution. When you're trying to figure out, I'm going to give a talk, I'm going to give a presentation, we're going to write a brief, start with the solution and think about all the things people need to know to get behind that solution, which is going to be generally detail about the solution. That's an example. I hope that's helpful.
That was great. Thank you, Rinku. And thanks to all of you for those really robust answers. So we've been talking about narrative a lot today, and we're going to move in now to some questions from the audience. And the first question is, it's for Rinku, but would love for all of you to answer if you have anything to share. And the question is, any thoughts or reflections on narrative as it relates to the insurgents at the Capitol last week? Or strategy for all of us out here as we help our communities process their, quote, new awareness, end quote, around white supremacy?
Yeah. One piece of advice is to just call them a white supremacist lynch mob. I've been saying, we had a lynch mob invade the Capitol. If you use the word terrorist, a lot of civil liberties attorneys and Muslims and Black activists, sometimes they're the same, Black and Muslim, have pointed out that the word terrorist evokes a particular image in the American mind, and it's not of Timothy McVeigh or that guy wearing the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt in the photos from the Capitol. So some words we use have bad implications for particular communities, and we get attached to them because it's like, well, we're pointing out the hypocrisy. You always call us terrorists, so now we're going to call you terrorists. That's going to come back to bite us in the ass. So just call them what they actually are, which is white supremacists and a lynch mob in that case. And I can drop the link in, but I also did an analysis of Arnold Schwarzenegger's speech, his video, which I thought was a very, very good narrative intervention. And I broke down why. So my first piece of advice is try to avoid domestic terrorism or even extremist as words to characterize, because we're not evoking what we think we're evoking. And then I'll drop something in with some more lessons.
Thanks, Rinku. Paris or Candice, anything to add? Okay, great. So this next question is for Paris and also all of the speakers. About combating disinformation and relational organizing, what practical advice and strategies do you have for building with people who don't share the same views to build a larger coalition? How do we approach conversations when many believe two different sets of facts? And how do we approach value conversations equitably with mutual respect, humility, and honor?
I actually feel like Rinku might be better positioned for that. I think in the reason why I say that is that she gave some good insight around moving people from allies to friends and disinformation. Like I do agree with that. Like the way that folks are going to get real information is if they're connected to people. It's not just like your own sphere, right? So when Candice said like my Facebook is good, I'm the same. I'm like, who are these people who have these like what is QAnon? I had to go find it. What do you mean there are people who are tagging things, save the children? I've never seen this. Like, where are these people at? Right. And then you just go, then I'll go search, and then I'll be like, whoa, there's a whole universe, there's a whole world. Right. So what I'll say is that for me, I think you have to figure out where it makes sense to build. That's what comes to me. Where does it make sense to put my energy into in reference to what we're trying to build collectively together? Now, there's some things that we just are not going to debate about, right? So is patriarchy real? I mean, that's not a debate. So are the systems of oppression real? Is there, that's not up for debate, right? So I think there are some of those things. Now, I think where it becomes interesting is where people may enter in those conversations. So I don't know. I feel like some people will feel like, well, I don't want to be a victim to the system, right? So I want to be triumphant. Like you're saying racism is ruining your life, but I overcome it, right? So that's sorry for you. And, I think that's a different entry point, because I can hear what we want to do is that we want to talk about more people being like victorious, right? But we don't want to make it seem like they just were able to post race, right? That actually these were like the things that helped you along, right? And so for me, it's a willingness to engage within limit, where it makes sense if you can actually build something. But I would love for Rinku to respond.
I mean, honestly, my best advice about this is that um, the quality or skill to build is just mastery over your emotions. I don't know about you, but I write like 7 rage tweets a day, and I usually do it at night, and then I don't publish them because I'm like, that's a rage tweet. And I almost never fall down, but I do sometimes. I deleted one last Wednesday. I left it up for 9 hours. It did make me feel better for those 9 hours. It really did. But then I realized like, it's just not the way I usually move in the world. And it was an extraordinary day. So having an extraordinary reaction, I'm not hating myself for that. But for me, what's hard about being with people who don't think like me is I just get upset. I get angry, and and then I kind of can't think really well. I can't hear them. I can't listen to them for openings. I don't want to ask them any questions because I'm like, you just suck. And so I have to be in the right kind of emotional space to do it. And I have to know when I'm going to hit my limit on that, which I will hit. And if I can have some self-awareness that way, then what I could try tactically can have some space to like come to me. And I can have the stamina to like stay in the conversation for a little while longer. Is it long enough? Who the hell knows? We're all just doing the best we can. But where I've been able to like move people, it's because I could keep extending a hand and not feel like my entire being was gonna be dead because of how long I was extending that hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that.
One thing I agree with a lot of that. One thing that I think about and I say to myself often is not everything is my ministry, right? Like I also get very clear about what I am good at, what I'm, the relationships that I do have, right? Like I don't think everything is about like, oh, I have to go over to that fire where I don't know anyone, I don't have a relationship, and I got to solve that. Now, if that's your ministry, if that's who you are, if that's where your talents, and you can do that, you have the emotional capacity to manage in that, great. I was talking to someone, and I was like, I think sometimes people attach a lot to the title of Chief Equity Officer. I was like, I can't do that. I don't know what you're talking about. How do you do that? Can you do that? Can you, right? Because some stuff I just have to understand is not everything is my ministry, but where it is, where I do have relationship, where I do have strength, where I do have the ability to be strategic and specific, or just have the relationship with someone, do that work and do it well. Where are there people in your lives that you are connected to? Where is it that someone has said something foul, but I actually do love and care about them? Am I going to cancel them, or am I going to spend this moment to try to understand and try to find a place for us to build? Now, I also understand where, okay, maybe I have to tap out because I'm not moving or I'm not the right person. So I think, this kind of understanding yourself, understanding your talent, your capacity, your relationships, your network, and moving from that place, I think kind of strengthens how purposeful you can be, and recognize that this isn't about you being some sort of hero with a cape solving every fire that's out there. You got to kind of know your ministry.
Thank you all so much. Those were such powerful responses and such a good reminder, because if we're not kind of, as Candice says, in our ministry, it can be really easy to overextend, to burn out, or to end up just having conversations that aren't as productive or useful as they could be. So I'm conscious of time, and we've got just a few minutes left, and we really wanted to end on a hopeful note. Everything you all have shared throughout this conversation has been really inspiring to me. And we wanted to end by having each of you reflect on what your New Year's resolution for the racial justice movement is. And let's see, Rinku, do you want to go first?
Sure. I would love it if we all committed to when we're reading or listening to each other or watching political communications, and I mean small p political, not like electoral communications, but policy, advocacy, demands. If we could read those now with an eye around story, and some of the specific things I've said, like how much is this problem and how much is its solution? Is there a story here anywhere where things actually happen? It's not just a static description. Are we celebrating our victories and lifting up everyday heroes? If you just read and listen differently as part of your as part of our learning process, then that'll help us learn and get better at this narrative shifting.
Thanks, Rinku. Candice, do you want to go next?
I often don't have very specific resolutions, but I'll just share a couple of things that have been on my mind. Is one, I've just been holding this thought in my head is the importance of sort of being transformed by what I've just experienced. That it's okay to rethink about what my central focus is given everything that has happened. So often I feel like sometimes we kind of put our stake in the ground and say, that's it, and that's where I'm moving to, and the whole world is moving around me, but yep, that stake and that's it. And sometimes it's effective, but sometimes I just realize like this Candice, this year and a half in Candice, Chief Equity Officer, is not the same one that started. And who's guiding the work? Is it that one from a year ago? Is it this one that just experienced everything that I just experienced? And so how am I gonna let, the moment that I'm in actually transform and show up in how I think and how I grow in the work? And how is that going to look in this year for me? So that's kind of what I hold myself to as I approach a year is what do I need to become? Where did I grow? And how's that growth going to show up in what I do and how I move in the work?
Thank you so much, Candice. Paris.
I think my New Year's resolution would be, find your people and like throw down and love them. So I really do believe it's important to join and be a part of organization. And there's lots of them that are out there that, are about the issues you care about or have shared, politics and identity. So I really am like, we need to be a part of organizations and movements so that we can continue to be building and learning and growing with each other. And so, yeah, to find your people, love them, and throw down with them.
That's beautiful. Thank you all for those very powerful intentions for the year. And thank you all so much for the incredible brilliance and wisdom and strategy advice that you just offered all of us. I hope everybody on the call with us today got as much out of it as I did. And so big thanks to our panelists. I wanted to just really quickly flag before we hop off that we at Race Forward really want to continue the conversation we're having today with you and to go deeper into specific policies and recommendations around immigration, police accountability, COVID response, and the power of youth organizing. And so the third webinar in this series will be taking place on March 3rd from 12 to 1:30 p.m. Pacific. And we hope to see you all there. Thank you, everyone.